Hiya. So today I'm writing a story about the common usage of social media and whether the way it's used has been sort of defined by common social practices that are reflective of everybody, or whether they're reflective of first use cases and the sort of expectations that are set during those like formative early periods. So there's two really cool pieces of information or questions that I want to answer as part of this research. One is the intent behind the development of some larger platforms versus how they are commonly used. So did they set out to be more utilitarian and then eventually became more supportive of certain kinds of content over time as just a reaction to their emerging audiences? And then the other part that I want to look at is common usage or trends amongst the early use demographics, so young middle class in developed economies versus common usage in mid to late use demographics, such as like elder generations or those in developing economies. Specifically, I'm quite interested in finding out whether or not communities of young or old people in some developing economies and really sort of densely populated areas that might have a more sort of like communitarian approach to everyday life, like saying hello to 50 people as you walk, and being really sort of involved in each other's lives and proximate to each other's lives, whether that creates a fundamentally different usage patterns in social media. All right. So this is particularly in the case of Facebook, but it looks like, and I'd never realized this before, I guess I might have heard rumors, but that in the earliest instance it was very much an exercise in what not to do with social media, or things that are wrong with social media. Zuckerberg apparently, creating Face Smash as a way to compare profile pictures of individuals and sort of rate their attractiveness. So, early users, developers, their sort of inclinations in those early days might cumulatively be having some of the negative effect that we observe more broadly. So while I think it's important to acknowledge, the sort of personal development of someone like Mark Zuckerberg, the evidence points to the fact that he's very conscious of the sort of positive potential of something like on Facebook, and is keen these days to really push that forward. It doesn't entirely undermine the fact it came from is something motivated largely by superficial social connection and face comparisons. So there's something unique about social connections at that like university level, which is where it was first propagated, that we might find is quite different if, say, a similar had been developed somewhere under. Should also mention that this article is about Facebook and Zuckerberg's efforts to connect everybody to the internet and to Facebook both, and that it would be really interesting to see the kinds of organic first usage that occur in some of these communities, such as those in India that he's been working with, as opposed to the organic first usage in other. So I'm just overlooking at some stats on Instagram at the moment. Obviously, these will have to be verified. So I'll go through and do that in a second. But it looks that, so first of all, early use was mostly university campuses in the US and other places. But also it's interesting to note that as the socioeconomic background, as average income increases, usage decreases. So it was saying here that 15% of US internet users who make less than 30K use Instagram, 14% of those making between 30 and 50, and 12% of those who make more than 50. This kind of fits with the narrative that a lot of social media platforms fit a sort of, a similar sort of social. Well, they fit the bill as a sort of social crux for a lot of other difficulties, in the same way that like sport and celebrity and daytime television do. I mean, this almost goes without saying, but of all these major social media platforms, the vast majority of them emerge from Silicon Valley. So emerge from, a particular part of a particular state of a particular country, and a lot of those first use cases do as well. So while it's not fair to homogenize even those places, or the particular groups of people in those places, it is undoubtedly less than representative, especially when you consider the global reach and global impact that the social media. So it's not really any surprise here that the United States has the most Instagram users overall. India with 75 million as the second, also not too much of a surprise given that it's been around a while, and the size of the population in India. It would be interesting to see how recent that growth to 75 million is compared to some of the other countries on here. And if it's a latest, are those users using it in the same way because it's established, or not? So here, this is clearly illustrated. The growth of social media usage in India has been quite dramatic and quite recent. It would be interesting to come back and find out how that compares to. It's also interesting to note the massive gender inequity in terms of users in India for both Instagram and Facebook, if this data is to be believed. Let's see. Yeah, so this information comes from some third-party software, so I'm not ready to trust it or follow it just yet. Look, I think I'm going to finish up this session for now. Hi there. So we're back this time, focusing on some more of the research around the different kinds of usage of social media in different parts of the world under different circumstances. The last research session was focused more on the stories of social media platforms, where their first users are, what the intent behind their usage was, and what the intent behind their development was. I'm not entirely satisfied with the info that I was able to find on that, so I will go back to that. But for now, I've found a couple of papers that might help to answer the second part of the question, so we'll look at those. So first up in the abstract for this paper, it says that social networks function as an important safety net in developing countries which often lack formal financial instruments. They're also an important source of information in developing countries with relatively low access to the internet and literacy rates. This is a similar point that was made in another paper that I read before, which I'll go back to, and that is that in places where there is a slightly more reliable information through traditional media, the role of social media becomes more about the sort of superficial social elements, whereas in places where the traditional media is less reliable or more controlled or regulated by some other power, social media becomes the defining source of information, and therefore it's the usage surrounding it changes inevitably as well. So there's a couple of things that this article makes, or this paper makes quite clear. One is that the kinds of usage that social media networks are depended on for in developing countries differs quite dramatically from developed countries. These extend to financial networks, acquire or making sort of financial transfers. Information flows generally outside of old mechanisms such as state media, as well as, interestingly enough, finding jobs. Much more dependent on networks established through social media platforms than any other sort of like centralized, job advertising platform. It looks as though that might be due to the fact that a lot of jobs in places like this simply aren't advertised, and job offers are extended through social networks. So getting on social media platforms and extending your network that way becomes critical for that reason. So already we're looking at some more utilitarian purposes than might otherwise be dominant in Western or developed economies. So already here in the abstract for this paper, we have it mentioned that social networks are relied upon in a lot of developing countries, competing with mainstream media, which is a point that had already been made, but also playing a significant role in social movements. That's certainly the case, and I've observed that from my own experience as well. Given that this paper mentions higher education in its title, that's not something that I'd previously considered, but it certainly makes sense that in certain parts where access to higher education or commuting to higher education institutions might be more difficult, the role of social media platforms in providing higher education, providing access to material available through higher education institutions would be really important as well. So a lot of this data from Pew Global is fairly expected and self-explanatory. Obviously, usage or access to the internet and usage of social media platform ballooned earlier and faster in developing countries, later and continues to grow it bloomed earlier in developed countries and it blooms later and it's continuing to grow in developing countries, whereas it's kind of plateauing in developed countries. However, while it addresses, the volume of usage, it doesn't really address the nature of usage, and I think that's what we're probably more interested in at this point. Now, this figure is particularly interesting, actually, and does go some way towards answering the question, and that is that amongst adults, social media usage would appear to be more popular in the Middle East. And from what it says here, China and other parts of the world than it is in Europe. So obviously the United States and places like that dominate, very, very popular usage. But then again, a lot of these platforms came from there. So for it not to be as popular in Europe as it is in the Middle East, it means that it's not just a socioeconomic thing, that there are ways that people are using, it sort of implies that there are ways that people are using social media in the Middle East that are more valuable and are seen as more valuable across generations than. In fact, just to further illustrate the point, as of 2017, it would appear that the highest rates of adult usage of social media are in Jordan and Lebanon. Now, this title kind of says a lot to me, actually, because I think what we're discussing here is in some ways the difference between social media helping people and social media, being something that people simply enjoy using. So something that provides an endorphin release, due to the nature of its use, versus something that sits and helps. And what we're seeing, particularly in some of those statistics from a moment ago, is that usage in places where it's helpful is actually continuing to go up and eventually exceed usage in places where it was simply a matter of releasing endorphins or enjoyment. So I think I'm going to end this session here for now. I still don't feel like I've gotten any data which has answered, even begun to answer the questions that I've had authoritatively on either front. There have been some interesting things raised, but there doesn't appear to be anything that would say whether or not the way social media is most commonly used, or portrayed as being most commonly used globally, is reflective of the nature of social media, or the nature of sort of broader cultural commonalities that we have, or whether or not it's down to those sort of like the ambitions of the founders and those and the practices of the early use cases. My gut still tells me that it's the latter rather than the former, and that by focusing on developing countries, or focusing on places where social media could serve more utilitarian purposes as first use cases, that we might achieve better long-term results for the use and culture of social media. But I will continue this research and see if I can find out any more information.